Good morning, everyone. And it's lovely to be here again and for it to feel like a big family party, which is always how it feels to me. This morning, I'd like to talk and play a little bit on the subject of 16th century divisions. And in essence, in the last 2 or 3, I wonder why I had more time in the last 2 years. Anyway, I did. I wanted to put together something like a missing book. You know, we don't have, Dowland's book of how to learn division. So that's in the essence of what I've been trying to do and want to share a bit with you this morning. Halfway through, Liz will join me and we're going to play 1 or 2 pieces. And first of all, to set the scene, we can go to the next page. Yeah, there's this lovely quote that sums it all up for me, and I'll just read it. And therefore, a certain learned man of much excellence, being asked what was such a figure and such a trope in rhetoric, and he said, I cannot tell you, quoth he, but I'm assured if you look in the book of my orations, you shall not fail but find them. So that he knew not the name of such and such figures, yet the nature of them was so familiar to his knowledge that he had the use of them whensoever he need. So this book is all about rhetoric, and this quote I love is because, a famous poet with all these rhetorical devices, and he didn't know any of them, but he used them. And I feel that relates to how I've related to playing divisions. And in that, I expect if I use 2 guitar sort of personalities to illustrate opposite ends of the spectrum. Eric Clapton doesn't read music. I heard him say once that when he's had a good day, his ears were connected to his fingers. And I think most of you in the room will at least know who he is and actually what it sounds like. Then the other end of the spectrum, somebody I studied with a little bit about 100 years ago, John Williams, and he said, it was very easy for him to read, but if he heard anything by ear, it went slower. So when he played in his group called Sky, the other guitarist could do everything, but he had to write it down. And personally, I feel like I'm in the middle at the moment. I can do a bit of that and a bit of that. Some of you may know that a while back I put together a book about continua playing. And when I did that, it was all, somebody asked me to write it, and it was because I've been doing it a lot. But I hadn't been studying it with somebody, and I hadn't really been looking at that many books. It made me look at some of the original sources, put together a method. And in writing this book, it's more that I needed to learn something first, get some experience and some understanding, like learning a new language and then finding a way to put it together. Some of you may have studied counterpoint and used a book by Fuchs called Graduus ad Parnassum. Yeah, everybody's nodding. I did that too. Took a course in counterpoint about 10 years ago, used that book, and it always struck me that he uses Palestrina from several generations before as the model, and I've always thought that he put together all of his rules from studying the music of Palestrina. So part of my own journey in the last few years has been to look back at our music, all of this wonderful big repertoire of solo music and duets and ensemble. Well, what divisions do we find there? Simple answer is lots. And this page. Can we go to the next page? Now, this little list here are all the books that we have in the 16th century for learning to play divisions, and not one of them is for the lute. Some of you may have looked at them. I tend to, when I open one, I look and there's hundreds of examples of how to play a second, an interval, and then I close it again. But when I've tried to play the divisions, they don't fit on my fingers. They don't seem quite right for the lute. So I've never really used them. I've looked at them for some examples. Most of us will know the pieces by Ortiz, 1553, and I find those the most accessible divisions. And again, I've looked at them to see, well, what does he do? And I heard a few years ago, before COVID, a recorder player who'd done some research on these books, and it had been on the computer, and he'd taken all the figures that were in the exercises, looked at the pieces that were ornamented in the back of the book, and very, very often the writer didn't use the exercises in the pieces. So there's and this was all to add up to, well, how can we know what did lute players do? And we have millions of examples of that. What I did find are these following methods for learning and teaching divisions. One is having cadential formulas. Every piece of music we have will have cadences, and they seem to be the ones that mostly have diminutions. And the second set of subject area would be how to fill in an interval. If you've got two notes an interval apart, what can you do? Next one is just standard musical phrases, not necessarily cadential or interval. And then the fourth one is what we find in a lot of the books from the previous list, ornamented versions of vocal works already written. And mostly, let's say, for example, in Botticelli, which is my favourite book for the style of the divisions, he prints the cantus part and then underneath it an ornamented version, so you can see clearly his creative ideas. And we also get the idea from these books of creating a separate part that doesn't keep to one voice at all, goes between them. We're going to come back to that. And then the last one, which is often I've had students, isn't this how we should learn it? We have to go to play a treble and ground bass and just learn. So yes, it's one way, but even looking at these books which are not for the lute, it wasn't the only way to play on a ground. So just to be clear, for us, there are two types of ornamentation. Graces, which we've all spent lots of time humming and hawing about, and what does the, certain little symbols, but they're the ornaments for one note at a time, so those sort of things, where we hear the principal note that's composed, and we add something else, but always with the left hand. So one of the ideas for us is just to continue that when we go into the second type, which is what we're going to talk about this morning, playing divisions, we always pluck them. So there are other words for divisions, diminutions, passaggi, coloraturen, and glossus. I forgot to put that on the list. And if anybody's new to the subject, all a division is you take one note and you play several notes that are faster to fit in to that. That's all it is. It's really simple. But the first time that I know that we can read in our repertoire left-hand slurs for playing quickly is in Kapsberger's first book for the chitarrone. I don't know how much lute players would have experimented before then. They're certainly easier with a longer string length. But the clear musical reason for plucking every note would simply be to get clarity and projection, because a lute note doesn't last very long. I should also thank David for rescuing me and doing that. In one of the books from the list, Virgiliano, he opens with a set of rules for how to make divisions, and his book is most about dividing something that's already there. I see that at least for us there are three types of occurrences that we need to think about. The first is when we embellish a pre-composed line, which might be in a dance where we don't have any varied repeats, but that could be more complicated. The second one is when we play over a harmonic foundation or repeated chords, a ground bass, where there's no melody to embellish. So that's freer. So it really is, it takes a little bit more imagination and a little bit more training to do that nicely and artistically. And then the third one is when we want to create a new line that weaves throughout all the voices, and particularly in the late 16th century, this was called a contrapunto. And later in the talk, we're going to end with one of those to give you an idea of how it sounds. Now, down to the nitty-gritty, just to make things clear. Set of rules, again, sort of based on Virgiliano, but not quite as complicated as he gave us. First rule is you mostly move by step. I've been in America too long, so that's what they say when you move one at a time. So if we had those as the principal notes, the most natural way that we find in most of our repertoires, you go in your scale that you're in by step, and you don't go. You might do that, but that's not melodic. But you might do. You wouldn't do that. And when we do that, we alternate between good and bad notes, or thumb notes and index notes, or possibly middle and index. So if we take example 3 there, the first dot on the second bar is a mistake. But we all know that you can hear the strong and weak, good and bad quality we get with that. But even non-lute players talk about that. Virgiliano talks about that. Almost everybody in the different instruments, they all had their way of playing good notes and bad notes. And that for us is represented, the bad notes are usually represented with a dot for the index finger. I've used a term for myself of anchor notes, just that the ones that belong to the original or are consonant with the harmony are on the beat, such as in exercise 3. So if these are the anchor notes, so you land on a good beat always with the anchor notes, with exceptions of course, but these are all general rules. Or in the all of the notes with a thumb, all of the anchor notes are consonant with a chord. And you'd think, well, this is perhaps opposite to jazz, where maybe some, and I'm not an expert, but my son plays the saxophone, so I'm listening to it a lot. You don't always arrive on the consonant note on the beat. And then the next important rule for us is that when you have, if you want to go to an interval bigger than either a tone or a third, then you need to move to a note that's consonant with a harmony. This comes from Virgiliano and from almost every piece you can look at. So if we have as the anchor chords, then I could go there because that's part of the first chord. This used to be the only vocal ornament in Monteverdi, back in the 70s and in the 80s. But this is putting together just the basic principles that I've already talked about. Consonant, consonant because it's a big interval, consonant, consonant. Second, example 7 is wrong. Even though the number of notes fits the interval, it sounds okay, but according to the rules, that's not allowed, or it's not good taste. However, when we come to a great composer like Dowland, he does it all the time. But so end of, I think this is from the Frog Galliard. So you have a D major chord, F sharp, he goes this interval. So we can either hear the C as a blue note, so a lovely exception to the rule, or it's coming from the missing, the D at the top, which we don't play. And you might also, if you treat it as a blue note, spend more time on it. And then 3 questions that I always ask myself: when should I want to ornament? One is cadences, and also static notes, notes that are just here, and then we could ornament it, or that's all a static diminution. And then the other one, connecting notes from one chord to another, a small figure that goes from one place to another. Now, what I did next was, well, I've got to look for examples so that any patterns that we want to define and develop come from original pieces of music. And I chose 12 from throughout the century and just looked at them, and I came up with these 12 definitions of types of diminutions that we see. I'm mostly today, in the time that we have, going to talk about 5 of them, maybe 6, but I'd like to mention what each one of them represents. So cadential is just when to keep that list there. So let's go to the next page. Yeah. So these are the 5 that we'll talk about. At a cadential cadence, the most common one is when we have a or, and it's the moving part that gets ornamented. If we count up the number of times those of us in the room have played that, it would be enormous. And many of the non-lute treatises talk about 3 levels of rhythm. And that's not on the slide there, but we've got them in this. If I double the ending, so it could either be 2 flags, 3 or 4, and one of the books says, many people forget about the fastest one, and some divisions, some of the pieces I'll play later, they only have the first 2 levels of speed, but the really good people could do all 3 levels. So the next of the 12 lists of types of divisions, triadic. So a division based on notes from the triad. And so if we take an F major triad and we call 1, 3 and 5, these are all good anchor notes because they're all part of the chord. And then if you take the notes between those all would be bad notes with the index finger, and it all fits. Now, a triadic type of division could be like that, or it could go outside of those 5 notes. If we look to the second line, second example from John Johnson, just to get the right number of notes for the rhythm and the interval, he goes 1 note lower. That's another version of it. And then the third one on that line, you can also go up to the La, put Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, and you don't go out of the triad really. And then the beginning of the third line is a very common one for us. So it goes below the tonic and it goes a little bit up to the minor 7. But these, once, don't practice major and minor scales, practice little patterns. And so to start with practicing patterns around the chords. And then you get them so into your fingers that you just do them, oh, I don't know what I did then. That would be a bit Eric Clapton-like. What we're looking at is a John Williams version. But even if we look at the very last 2 examples that come from a Francesco fantasy, it's just a triad figure. And also what I found when I looked at music, that English composers loved to use triad figures more than anywhere else in Europe. There's a huge amount of variety of styles. Moving right on, so a static division, and I first heard this term from a student when I was teaching in The Hague, and he was studying with William Donglois, the cornet player, and he used the term static. So it just means any division that starts and ends on the same note and centres around that. And this is a little very good example from John Johnson. So it simply goes down and up. That maybe 50 years later it might be slurred and become a grace. But here, and many of Johnson's divisions are static. And that fits in the first sort of level of ornamenting that Virgiliano says you should come back to the note that you start with in order to go on. And then, yes, thank you. A huge variety of patterns and figures to learn, with some often repeating ones that we all have in our ears, will be intervals. And I noticed that there were 2 types of these. One was simple. You're filling an interval and you go straight as the crow flies. You don't mess around anywhere. You go in one direction only. And this is the easiest one to learn because there's a limit to that. If you have a 5th and you want to go directly there without doing anything else, you can change the rhythm. But as far as the left-hand fingers being in touch with the ears, that's the simplest version. So the one we've got there is an octave. We've all heard and played, and usually with that rhythm. And just the 2, when we're dividing an interval, those are our anchor notes, or such as at the end of most strains of a dance. And the second type of interval division, a compound one where it doesn't go as the crow flies, it will mess around. And so the one that you can see there, that interval of a 5th, I could go as we've had before, but you can, that's not written down, but I went down a fourth, and then it gave me an octave to play, and it's the same number of notes, but this one that I've written is, that's going melodically, not jumping at a big interval. So the first 5 notes, in how I'm wanting to define it myself so that I can learn it, is a static division. Get back to where I started. Then I have a simple division of a fifth. And then it is really completely a question of joining the ears with the fingers. And then for me also understanding what the hell I'm doing. And then the last term, I've not seen the term in any book, a doubler. Some of you may know the book from Agazzari, 1607, about, it's one of the first books to talk about how to play above the bass. And Agazzari divides instruments into 2, one group that can provide a foundation, just all the right harmony, nothing else. And then another set of instruments that were used as ornamental instruments, and the lute's in both. But he says that the lute is the most noble instrument and it's the best one for doing ornamentation. And one of the things he talks, well, lute player can do this, play chords, quick things, and redoubling, whatever he means by that. It could mean playing in intervals, it could just mean going twice as fast. And from that, I noticed very often, especially when we're thinking of the 3 levels of rhythm, that if we have second beat, I'm going to double, still going in the same direction, but all a doubler does, and I've found millions of them, in every piece, you just go down and up to make twice as fast. So you go double as fast. Or if I did it for the whole scale, and it just trips off the finger. It's very easy. But you just have to... And whenever I've been playing with violinists or something and they've never really divided before, this is the type of thing they try first. It's the easiest one. You keep your same direction, you have lots of anchor notes, but it's easy. Now, if we can ask Liz to come up, please. Next. Could we go to the next page? Thanks, yeah. And then it's a Romanesca pattern. Usually Romanescas were in triple time. This one's in duple time. And most of us will know it's a very, very simple starting teaching piece, treble and ground. And what you see on the score, the top line, I'll play, and I've tried to identify what type of division are we doing. And the second line is an imaginary line of anchor notes. So if that's how the first 2 bars go. So if that was given to us, we could ornament it by playing the first one. We could also ornament it lots of other ways. But again, I feel a bit like Fuchs going back to Palestrina to understand how things are constructed. So as we go through, you'll see mostly only static divisions or triads. And these are all just triads, and he uses them to great extent. And should we hear it? Should we test it? before we leave that one, I want to ask you, who heard the consecutive fifths and octaves? We're playing exactly what's written. No, nobody. So, contrapuntal rules are that between two voices you shouldn't have parallel consecutive fifths or octaves. But I've written them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 6 events there, and they often happen in the same place. In the third line where we've got G minor, and then didn't hear it, did you? And then there's another one from the second bar to the third bar where we have F major. I wonder, is it because we played so well, or does it actually sometimes not matter? And it's not exactly two voices. Liz had harmonic structure and a few little passing notes. Let's just play the very first one. Do you hear it from bar 3 to 5? Now I've pointed it out. Let's put it once more. It might be because of the quality when you play a diminution or division, the bad note or the non-anchor note doesn't count. So it's just a thought as we go on. That I don't think you can avoid them. Now. The next thing we'll do is a little bit more practical. Yes. If we look to a very famous duet of John Johnson, the Queen's Treble, it's just 3 chords. Can we make it smaller? Please. Just apple plus a dash. Okay. And again, that's good. That's good. Even if it's a bit blurred, you can see that 80% of the divisions that Johnson uses are triads. So I thought, although it's a well-known piece, if we put you in this world and we'll play you the duet, and then we're going to have a little lesson of how you might learn those patterns. How is that F? Not bad, that's good. we may be familiar with Johnson's style, and I have to say now that I've been just being curious about, well, how are the divisions made? You know, as I play, I'm not scared of them anymore. Even the last one, oh, so fast it goes on. And it's just triads. And then there's, when we hear, when he goes near the end, that's a blue note. I think it's about the only one in the piece. And of course he takes one rhythmic motif for each division, develops it and then goes on to another one. And it's such good learning material. And as you can see, there are almost either triads or static divisions. Now, if we go... If we go and lose everything, what is it? Yes. So this is just a little sample of how you might put together a few ideas and develop little patterns from this ground. You've heard the ground, so that's step one. And the three groups of notes that my fingers are getting familiar with, I'll explain that in a minute. That's all. Now, each 5/3 chord, each root position chord has 3 notes, but we have to be careful, as we've just heard Johnson does it brilliantly, which one should we start with at the beginning of each bar to make sure we don't hear octaves. You didn't hear them in the Greensleeves duet, but you would hear them if we did them now. So if we take, I'll keep to this step. So the second of the options, patterns to learn, that starts with 1. Now the next one starts with 1, but only, instead of doing, if I do it all, then we get a sort of Elton John type piano accompaniment, where it's just fifths and octaves. Not knocking that at all. So the first option if we want to learn the interval of a fifth on each chord, we can do it in 5 ways. At least I can do it. I'm trying that. One is just to use those 5 notes. The second option would be to start on the 3rd. So if we had an F major quarter, then it'd be flat. Then you won't ever have, we won't ever hear the octaves or fifths. The second one would be to combine them both, where F, then a 3rd, and then I'm going to run out of notes. But we can start with the 1st or the 3rd, or we can reverse it, and we've just heard that. Maybe not consciously, but in the duet that we played, those are all there. And the last option is each bar begins on 1 and ends on 3. So when you're dealing with 3s, you don't have any parallels. So F. Like that. And just practice these little patterns, consciously starting on 1 and 3, and then you put them together. Let's play through step 2, so if we can just, so you can hear all these options. Second option, starting with a 3rd. that, that doesn't make a complete piece, but these are like Carcassi studies, things to develop your hands. So, step 3 would be to add, a little downward arpeggio at the end, because what we just played was a bit empty at the end. So let's play 2 versions of step 3. Just varying from A to B, I was just varying the rhythm, but using the same ear to finger patterns. And then if we start adding a doubler to some of the figures in step 4, I'm going to add it to the second beat. And then we could keep that and add it to the first beat. Step 5, yeah, good. Which is, in fact, the basis of the last division that Johnson gives us. Then we can do it one more where we add a doublet to the third beat, which is step 6. And then step 7. Can we go up a tiny bit, David, just to get the last bit? If not, you can imagine it. In step 7, thank you, yeah. From the beginning note, go down a fourth, then up an octave. Now, on the middle 2 chords, you can do this something similar, but you have to go down the 6th. And then back, so let's give them that one. So these are all following the basic rules that we set up. Good and bad notes, anchor notes. If you have a big interval, it's got to be consonant with the chord. And then step 8, you can just vary the rhythm. And so on and so on and so on forth. And then we get to step 9 and 10 where, having started, we'll try it in different keys. And then it's a bit like divisions for dummies. I found, having done that, I understand a bit more of what I'm doing, just a bit more. Now, we won't do this because of time. Can we go to the next page? So, our final piece, very famous mid-16th century madrigal that lots of people used, Anche col partire by Dorore. Let's go through the next. This is just a score. We can see that it starts on an A, so you have to now think we've got A lutes for the pitches to correspond. And what we find, for example, in Terzi's books, you'll find lute duets, and they're very often of different pitches, and one plays all of the madrigal, and the other one plays a bastarda type part, a contrapunto, and all based on this. Of course, musicians then didn't have scores. All of these pieces were published in part books, and that's how people learnt and experienced them. Let's keep going. Yeah, that's it. The score is if I talk to people who can't read lute tablature. There's no point in showing them this. So as we go through, this is where Taro is a very helpful assistant, and thank you, David and Tara, for helping. Liz is going to play the top part, which is a very simple intabulation of the madrigal. But it's based on the one that we find in Palladino, but I've taken out a few of the ornaments and changed the ficta, but you will recognise it. And then I've written, because I'm not good enough yet to sit here and improvise a contrapunto like this, but I think they did then. So this is my next stage. And I've got a list of the things related to Agazzari's list of what lute players should be able to do. So you hear 3 levels of rhythm in the divisions. You'll hear syncopations. You'll hear harmonic triads, so like arpeggios. Instead of it all being melodic, there will be some parts which will be using the notes of the harmony. You hear lots of interval divisions as scales and patterns that weave around, and at the cadence lots of the cadential formula that they called a gruppo or gruppo. And as we find in a lot of our duet repertoire, using the whole range of the lute. So not just in the treble. Well, we've been listening to patterns. I've been playing it in the treble mostly, but I'll go into the bass as well. And trying to give some imitation in these extra ideas that we're adding to the madrigal. So this is not me, but if you imagine a good saxophone player improvising with a band, that this is what a lute player might have done then, hopefully, or better. Let's just check our G's. Does anybody in the room, do you know the madrigal? Yes, yeah. is very much. This is our third time we played it, something like that, yes. I think I could say I couldn't have written that down until I'd done the work on looking to, well, how do you put things together? Or it would have taken me so much longer. And so for myself, the next stage is just to sit and do it and not have to write it down. So that the patterns are just there. But you have to know the piece very well. So it's nice to take a madrigal, and I play the Palladino. Oh, you'll hear it this afternoon. And it's sort of there. That's the end of the planned talk. If there are any questions or observations. Yes, Matt.
Thanks very much, Nigel.
You're very welcome.
I heard somebody like Robert Levin, who's a piano player.
Yeah.
He famously improvises the Mozart cadenzas, and he just says he thinks classical music, he wants people to be sort of staying up all night thinking about classical music, and they want to be actually totally on the edge of their seats. And I just feel like this is, the really, really exciting beginnings of something really enormous. Do you think that sort of the next generation of players are going to be doing concerts where they just look at each other and say, lacrimate, and then they just do their own version? So it's not lacrimate, it's like jazz players who know the version that they do.
Yeah.
And they just know the repertoire so well that they just create their own pieces. And then the same with a Baroque suite. Vice was supposedly just making stuff up all the time. So do we go to concerts and people just play a whole suite? Do you feel like that's kind of around the corner? So that's one question. The second question is, I've tried improvising in concerts, and I'm a bit of a chicken when it comes to this sort of thing, as a lot of people are who don't have that much experience. But it's about training. So what is your, this is for Liz as well, in your professional performing life, how much are you doing, seat of your pants improvising? How much are you in your training students? The jazz department at the academy, for example, are you talking with the jazz guitarists saying what you do with the young jazz guitarists? Because they have to do extraordinary things. Are you, drilling the young players to be able to have this capacity? When I teach guitarists, little kids now, I get them to improvise right from the beginning.
Yes.
Because the classical players just, and then there's the pop players who just improvise because they don't think of it. But there's some disconnect there. So how much are you improvising in your professional life, and how much are you doing with your students? Sorry, there are a lot of questions there.
That's fine. There are 100 questions. The first bit is easy, that I notice amongst my colleagues of one generation younger than myself, that there's more practice of improvising. So Bor Zulian, he did a whole concert of improvising. And Rolf Lisbon used to do the same, and there's a recording of a whole CD of a band, playing, and then they're improvising. And I think if we take Agazzari's little list of what a lute player could do, I think that's the next sort of set of shoes to step into. And it does just take time and practice. And so to answer your second question, when I have the chance, I'll try to drill students this way if they're interested. And it's different from learning continuo, where that's also improvising, but there are more notes, and it's like the boundaries are more easily set. But yes, a good musician to sit down and play anything, whatever it is. Usually, if I play Lacrimae, I haven't got it written down. It's one of those pieces I know, and I'll play it a bit differently each time. And we played something in Basel, yes, with the encore, yes. Yeah, so, when you know a piece well, you just sit down and play it, and it's just always different. I've never heard anybody yet improvise a whole suite in the Baroque form. But with all the interest in partimento that we have these days in the last 15, 20 years, this art of having a bass line with figures and improvising a complete piece above it, I think that's also part of the next generation.
Yeah, if you look at today's language, you can see lots of turns of phrase that he does in different movements of the same suite.
Yes, yeah. So yes. Simple answer, yes. Yeah. Liz, did you want to add something?
Well, I think it's a great question. I talk to the jazz department at the Academy quite a lot because the head of jazz and I happen to be friends. So that's often a basis for starting a conversation. And we go to each other's performances, we sit in on each other's classes, and I sound very old when I say the younger generation of students. Often, for example, we played the Fairy Queen this week with 4 lutes. I was one of them. We had 3 different entry points to the lute. We had somebody who was playing the theorbo for the first time, working with figured bass. We had somebody who's playing banjo, guitar, new music, and also jazz coming to the theorbo for the first time. The third player was coming from classical guitar, very much more from the John Williams frame of mind. And we had 4 different approaches to how much we wrote down, how much we added, how much we didn't, where we were thinking anchor onto the bass. I find in this talk the really interesting thing is that improvising contrapunti or trebles, you need to have that anchor in the way that with continuo playing, we're used to stepping out from the bass, I can't think of anything, so I'll go back to the bass, being comfort zone and home. So it's great that you've identified there are these melodic anchor points as well. So if we set off on something and it's not quite going where we planned, we know where to come back to. Which
just play the original.
Is a really good method, works for whatever part you're improvising away from. But often guitarists coming for the first time will say, "My mind's gone blank, I can't think of anything," and then we just work on. Okay, you went 3 steps away. Now next time you might go 4, but you can always come back. So it's never going from nothing to completely improvised. There's always these steps in between.
And I would say that one of the benefits, whatever level one is as a player, is understanding the compositions that are already there. So you can we have to understand the counterpoint and where to find the voices, but to understand where the divisions are going and so that you can play different ones eventually. But I found it enormously helpful in the last 2 or 3 years. That's what's going on. It's like learning a language where you're not writing it down and you're just talking with each other. But then you can also write letters to each other in that foreign language. And I hope very much that more and more people will improvise. And I'm sorry we never got to talk on Zoom about that 3 years ago. Any other questions? Michael?
I'm conscious of the fact that you are putting in a lot of work and research into how they did things and so on. That's the basis of what you're doing now, which is terrific. And to me, what it should be, what I have reservations about is, I'm surprised to hear the second one, in these days of crossover, etc., etc. I just hope that players don't take the shortcut and just do what takes their fancy.
Yes.
Because I think it's essential. Well, it's not essential. I mean, some people would say that's what we want to hear. But I think it's very important to stay within the culture of music we're playing. I mean, that's the micros, that's what I would want to hear. And I enjoy the improvisation. So long as you think some of the things very I can see my start life as a banjo player coming through this improvisation. To me, it's not interesting. But to many people, of course, it would be.
Yeah. So I would say to you, don't worry. Because, everything that we heard this morning sounds like it's from the 16th century. So that's what I would encourage people to do. If we're not going to be able to stop the stray sheep, if they want to do a crossover and then it won't sound like 16th. Your hear something later that is in the 16th century, but in my recital. We won't stop the explorers, but we can tell if it's going out of the boundaries.
I think again, it's in a lot of the authors in language you're aware of. You know, think of the audience who I'm hearing the knowledge of the audience, but it is because I can say a lot of your audience are not that knowledgeable, and they don't necessarily know what they're getting.
Yeah.
And that's
Don't worry.
if people are honest about what they're doing.
Yes.
I think I should have clarified actually. So I'm talking about coming from banjo or classical guitar. It's like somebody who can then speak 3 different languages. They wouldn't say one sentence in French and then another in Italian. And so you're coming from that traditional language and entering a new tradition and language from wherever your starting point. Isn't to suggest that you would necessarily mix them all up.
Yeah.
But it is like being, it's an extraordinary and quite admirable to me who can't do that, fluency in a lot of different languages. But that's not to say, as I say, the verb is Spanish and the Italian is and the noun is Italian and all that. You can still know what language you're speaking at any particular time.
Yes.
Thank you so much for the talk. I was wondering how difficult was how different was the approach by people such as Spinacino, in particular in the duets which are based on the vocal models.
Yes.
So how easy is to find these patterns applied to such music from the earliest part of the 16th?
Yeah. What I noticed, and I haven't done enough work on that, and I'm sort of getting to that I played a couple of the Spinacino duets, and I thought, what are these? And they just ramble on, and so but I can still see a lot of the patterns of cadential and intervals and filling in the space. But it must come from earlier, allowing more dissonances on the beat. So even in Neusiedler, we'll get that. So it's almost like as we move into the 16th century, they got more into the boundaries that I stated this morning of everything being consonant mostly on the beat except for suspensions. Whereas if you delve into Spinacino, there seemed to be either he was a very bad composer or there are mistakes in the printing, or it's just allowing a different way of improvising that comes from earlier. And I think going from one composer to another, everybody does it differently, and so and that's just going to happen. Yeah. So that's good. If I come back next, 3 years, perhaps we'll talk about Spinacino then. Yeah, Chris.
I was just thinking about a lot of us amateur players have kind of mixed feelings about divisions.
Mm-hmm.
A piece like, say, a lovely tune like the Ballad Book Jig. It's a fantastic tune, and you play it, and you want to hear it again.
Yes.
And divisions are almost like an excuse to hear it again.
Yes.
But then you come across John Langton's Pavane.
Yes.
Beautiful, beautiful melody. I've been playing at my funerals.
Yes.
Lovely melody. And you get to play it, and you get this divisions.
Yes.
Well, how can we make them say something? A, how can we make them say something? And B, have we got to accept there's been a change in taste? Because even Robinson says at the end of the century, he says, doesn't he, in the old days they played hurry, hurry like a cat in the gut.
Yes.
So making them say something, and do we have to accept there are things which don't work for us?
Yes. If we think about Dowland and look at all of the divisions in the versions that we have, including Langton's Pavane, we can see, like Purcell or Bach, he takes the boundaries and stretches them. Since you mentioned that to me in Basel, I thought, I must look at, but I didn't have time to analyse Sir John Langton's. And I'm sure that actually if I did, I'd find all of the different categories. It's just how you choose which ones to do. The syncopation rhythms, the jumping from one voice to the other. The last of my list of 12 I wrote down as recomposing. So very often Dowland, a bit like Baroque, later composers will take the piece and then do something completely far away, which is what we get in Langton. I think in the Langton Pavane it's the variety of rhythms but we still get cadential ornaments. We get things that so try it. But it's more than that. But that's where it comes from. So I've in the little bit of Dowland that I've been playing, while thinking about all this, it all makes more sense. There's hope. Yes. Should we stop now?
Questions? Oh, well, thank you very much,
Yeah,
Nigel.
you're welcome.